Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
So there are all different ways that you can attack these systems, and you really just have to layer this approach to say, well, depending upon the type of threat we have and the environment that we're working in, which of the holes in the layers of Swiss cheese is that threat going to be able to potentially get to my asset?
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 448. How is Oklahoma State University helping the nation stay ahead of emerging drone threats while advancing the future of drone and counter-drone technology? To explore that question, we're joined by Dr. Jamey Jacob, Executive Director of the Oklahoma Aerospace Institute for Research and Education, and the Williams Chair in Energy Technology at Oklahoma State University. Under his leadership, OSU launched the Counter-UAS Center of Excellence, now the nation's central hub for coordinated research, development, testing, and evaluation of counter-drone systems. Working closely with the Joint Force CUAS University at Fort Sill, the center assesses vendor technologies, establishes performance standards, and accelerates next-generation defenses, all while addressing the growing national shortage of highly trained engineers. With unique testing environments and deep alignment with military needs, OSU plays a pivotal role in strengthening national security and maintaining U.S. leadership in UAS innovation. Beyond directing the center, Dr. Jacob is a Regents Professor of Aerospace Engineering and a nationally recognized leader in emerging aerospace systems, securing nearly $50 million in research funding from federal agencies and industry partners. He has testified before Congress on the critical need for sustained investment in drone research and advanced air mobility, and he leads major initiatives including the EDA-funded Launchpad and UAS Flight Corridor, NASA's WindMap weather program, OSU's work within the Tulsa Hub, and the NIST initiative developing certification standards for next-generation aircraft. A native Oklahoman, he holds degrees from the University of Oklahoma and UC Berkeley and is an FAA Part 107 pilot with roughly 500 flight hours. In this episode of the Drone Radio Show, Dr. Jacob talks about OSU's efforts to advance the nation's counter-UAS capabilities, what Ukraine's drone innovations reveal about the future of warfare, and how OSU's research in atmospheric science, public safety, and wildlife applications is shaping the next generation of drone operations. But before we hear from Dr. Jacob, I want to stress that your support is the heartbeat of my podcast. Every episode is crafted with you in mind, and your generous donations ensure I can keep delivering the content you love. Whether it's a price of a coffee or a more substantial contribution, every bit helps to defray the cost of production. Donate today and be a vital part of the podcast's continued path to greatness. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And if you can please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and leave a nice review, it really helps improve the podcast ranking among the many thousands of active podcasts today. And by the way, if you have a great story on the use of drones that you'd like to share in a podcast, contact me at randy@droneradioshow.com. So let's learn how Oklahoma State University is helping the nation stay ahead of emerging drone threats while advancing the future of drone and counter-drone technology with Dr. Jamey Jacob. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Dr. Jacob to introduce himself.
Jamey Jacob. I'm a professor of aerospace engineering at Oklahoma State University and executive director for the Oklahoma Aerospace Institute for Research and Education, or as we call it, OAIR.
Dr. Jacobs, can you give us an overview of OAIR, its mission, and the primary services it provides?
OAIR is one of our 4 institutes that we have here at OSU, primarily to serve our land grant mission as a land grant university, to support the citizens and companies of the state, region, and nation in emerging aerospace technology. So our focus is pushing the envelope in what we can do in the exciting world of aerospace.
Is it all research-oriented?
It is not. And actually, outreach is one of our large components, really pushing the envelope in terms of what students are challenged with doing. And that includes not only graduate and undergraduate researchers at the university, but also high school students and K through 12 across the entire panoply. So we actually had a huge event yesterday with over 30 schools from across the state focused on a drone search and rescue challenge as an example of that mission.
How long have drones been part of OSU's research programs and curriculum?
One of the things we like to say is we were doing drones before drones were cool. And my predecessor, or I should say colleague, who I joined here back in 2006, I came here explicitly because of the drone program that he had set up. And he had started doing this back in the 1990s, really using drones, or as we called them back then, remote-controlled aircraft, as a way to teach students about the design challenges of full-scale aircraft. As I was going through, my aerospace curriculum as an undergraduate student, for example, we didn't build aircraft, we designed them. And our output was a 100-page report that would tell us, great, you know how to design an aircraft. What that doesn't tell you are the implications of that design. Can you manufacture it? Just because you can design it on CAD or a piece of paper doesn't mean you can actually build it. And then once it's built, can you service it? One of the things that we're focused on really when we think about it, is it going to perform like the equations will tell us to perform? But for something to be not just feasible, but viable, it has to work well and be serviced well. And so I came and joined OSU in 2006, primarily to start a drone flight test program, which again was still a pretty novel idea at the time, 20 years ago.
OSU also houses a Counter-UAS Center of Excellence. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. So we have a Counter-UAS Center of Excellence really focused on evaluating counter-UAS technology.
Looking back over the last 5 to 10 years, how has the rapid advancement of drone technology changed both the nature of threats and the opportunities to mitigate them?
Now, if you look at how this has evolved, over, say, the last 10 to 15 years, it was really initially kind of driven as a threat concern from, the war in the Middle East, both Afghanistan and Iraq, where we had adversaries essentially using off-the-shelf technology as that threat, literally buying stuff off of Amazon. We had these records from ISIS where they were purchasing these systems and doing really garage-level modifications as a threat. And a decade ago, when we started seeing these, right, we had very little way or very little recourse to be able to defend against them. You can take something like a standard consumer-grade quadcopter and outfit it with a 40-millimeter mortar or grenade, for example. And what are you going to do but shoot it down? And so you really started to then see this, just like very similar to the trajectory of IED defenses. How do you defend against this improvised explosive device? How do you defend against a drone? And the systems that we were primarily using, the small UAS and the much larger systems, were engineered from a very different mindset. Really thinking about this from an aerospace defense grade technology working down to a smaller system, where these asymmetric threats were really driven by consumer grade and hobbyist technology. How do we then take those systems to make them more capable to do something such as, attack a base?
What unexpected challenges or weak links in counter-UAS have you uncovered that most people might not be aware of?
It's an ever-evolving set of links. And just because you have one weak link, once you solve that, you always find another. And we always think about defense against UAS really as a layered approach. And it doesn't matter if you're doing this for a commercial airport in the US and you're just trying to protect yourself from careless actors that are flying their drones where they shouldn't be, or whether you're trying to protect yourself from terrorist threats, where now you have malicious actors that are using drones to actually try to attack a military base or critical civilian infrastructure. There is no one single technology that will be able to defeat those threats. What you do have are a layered approach. One, first, can you detect it? And can you even determine if there's a drone there? Second is then to identify it. Can you determine, is this friend or foe? And if it's something unidentifiable, how can you tell whether it's just a careless drone or whether it's a malicious threat? And you have to be really careful with that, because just because it's careless doesn't mean that you want to shoot it out of the sky, because that can cause more damage than if you were just to leave it alone. And so you really have to consider how you're dealing with that. And then finally is the defeat piece. Is it, a kinetic defeat technology? Is it radio frequency where you're trying to jam it or hijack the system? Are you using some kind of directed energy? So there are all different ways that you can attack these systems. And you really just have to layer this approach to say, well, depending upon the type of threat we have and the environment that we're working in, which of the holes in the layers of Swiss cheese is that threat going to be able to potentially get to my asset?
How would you characterize the United States' current ability to counter unwanted drones, whether malicious or accidental? Where are the major gaps today?
I think a great example is what was happening, most recently on the East Coast in New Jersey, and really first being able to identify aircraft in the air. And of course, we've now determined that many of the public sightings were actually just manned aircraft, both commercial airline and general aviation traffic. And this all comes from people not generally looking up in the sky and going, oh, what are those blinking lights flying over me? Well, those are the same blinking lights that are flying over you every night that are going to Newark or JFK. But if you expand upon that and look at some of the tests that were actually happening there were, most of these were valid tests that were happening, but there have been a number of incursions on military air bases, again, where it's been demonstrated that we have an ability to detect and identify, let alone defeat the systems that are flying over sensitive areas within the U.S. And I think the challenge there is how rapidly this technology is evolving and our ability to pivot quickly to be able to perform these detect, identify, and defeat components of this strategy. If we see what's happening in the Ukraine-Russian conflict, you're quite literally seeing this technology evolve on a weekly basis, modifying systems in order to be able to counter the latest counter system that's been developed to keep your drones from flying against your enemy. And so that's a real difficult challenge, particularly with how slow we typically move, particularly at the government level.
How is OAIR helping to address those gaps through its research programs, testing capabilities, and partnerships?
Our Counter-UAS Center of Excellence has really two primary missions. One of those is to evaluate the threats. So we're looking at systems that are being developed overseas. Our own engineers, thinking outside the box in terms of, well, what would I do if I were trying to overcome some of the defenses, in the U.S. or abroad, and being able to replicate those. How do we come up with a way to inexpensively develop something that we can fly to test the systems? And that leads directly into our second mission that our OAIR team works on, which is primarily evaluating the technology. How well do the systems actually work? Can we find out what those gaps are, testing them in a friendly environment before we send those systems out into the field? So know what our weaknesses or our weak links are before we actually tension that chain and try to break those links, because we'd rather break them here before we send the systems out. And so that's really our team working with both the government as well as the vendors, the developers of the systems to determine how effective the capabilities are. And then that allows us to start to layer these pieces of Swiss cheese together and say, well, this technology will work really well with the gaps in this technology to minimize those potential gaps when you're putting the systems out in the field.
Have you developed any standardized evaluation processes for assessing counter-UAS systems or vendor technologies? Essentially, a common measuring stick.
That's actually what we're doing right now. And so we've essentially been tasked with coming up with, we'll call it the UL equivalent for these technologies. The challenge is different systems do different things. And so again, you end up with a whole different set of measures for each one of these. Some of these are going to evaluate in inches, some of them in centimeters. And, those systems may never line up with one another.
Turning to Ukraine, what drone tactics or innovations have stood out to you from that conflict?
Really kind of focus on the small UAS. They really have leveraged first-person video or FPV drones as their primary resource. And you can see a couple of things that they have really advanced, over this really relatively short period. Some of those are using onboard targeting technologies. So that way, even if you lose that ability to see, that primarily, you have a drone operator, they're using, first-person video goggles or some other type of video transmission system, so that way they can identify the targets. And if they happen to lose a link, being able to have the system still travel, to its intended target using onboard autonomy. Another, good example of what they've been able to do is really advance optical fiber technology rather than using radio frequency, because you end up being able to jam or hijack those systems. So that way you're, removing that emitting capability altogether. And you can think about this in terms of two threads. One is first being able to detect it. If the system is sending information back to the pilot in terms of its telemetry, where it's at, other information on board about the health of the system, that then becomes a targetable source. So you can not only jam it, but you can also figure out where it's at, and then also figure out where the operator is at. And so now your Russian forces, for example, can not only try to attack the drone, but also attack the operator, which is the real danger from the Ukrainian side, is losing that expertise with that drone pilot and loss of life. So you're using a fiber optical system now removes that. So your drone is no longer emitting any RF. So it becomes very difficult to track. You have to use either radar or acoustic systems or some other EO, IR, or electro-optical infrared technology in order to be able to detect that. And I think those two things in and of itself have really changed how we look at that battlefield for drone operations.
The real value is applying those lessons here. How does OSU help translate what's happening in Ukraine into scalable insights or systems for the U.S. military and its allies?
Let's kind of focus on the development piece. And if you look at 2024 as an example, the total number of drones that the U.S. Department of Defense purchased in total in the calendar year 2024 is the same number that Ukraine is producing in a day. Now, of course, those are very different metrics that we have in terms of the procurement requirements and level of technology that you would have from the U.S. DoD to what the Ukrainians are doing, primarily using smaller distributed manufacturers across the entire country. But that shows how far behind we are, and our real challenge is not technology, but it's supply chain. Being able to source these systems, particularly from countries that are aligned with us. And so most of these systems or many of these technologies come from countries of concern. So because of that, it makes it very difficult, for us to be able to scale up in terms of manufacturing. And that's where the real challenge is. If we need to produce, thousands of drones a day, how are we going to do that at a reasonable cost? And that's the real challenge that we're working with companies and government agencies to help solve right now, is to be able to fix this supply chain component.
Are we still in the early stages of developing effective solutions, or do you see promising options already emerging?
No, we're still very early, right? And it's really the government just starting to rethink about how they do this. First off, in terms of procurement, rather than having, for example, have to have a flag officer, you'll be able to approve a purchase. Now you can go down to something, for example, at the battalion level instead. So here, the captain has the authority to be able to authorize some of these purchases. So, first off, you kind of think about is getting the bureaucracy out of the way, but that in of itself doesn't fix the supply chain problem. And that's a very challenging problem, particularly in the current environment that we're in. So we have a long way to go before we fix this problem, even if it is fixable.
From your experience, is the current administration more receptive or engaged on these issues than previous ones?
Well, I think it's certainly recognized that it's a challenge, right? And, at least having a vocal recognition that this is a problem. We don't yet have a good plan in place to be able to solve this. And so we'll have to see, whether that comes to fruition or not.
Switching gears, can you explain the WindMap project and its goals?
I think WindMap is one of our programs that we have, and that one was specifically a NASA effort. Weather intelligent navigation data and models for aviation planning, or really advanced air mobility planning. The idea here is how can we use UAS or drones to give us better situational awareness about the atmosphere. And you have to first off think about where most of our weather data comes from, with towers that sit on the ground. We have satellites that look from the orbit down, but those are all missing really important elements that are required for meteorologists to be able to put their models together. And most of that data still comes from radiosondes. These are these small systems that are put on helium balloons that, basically launch from the ground. They go up to around 100,000 feet, and they provide this profile information about really important data, primarily temperature, pressure, and relative humidity, as well as wind speed. And these are things that are really difficult to get from remote sources. So you really need what's called an in situ measurement. It's like, wetting your finger and sticking it in the air, and that's, how you tell the temperature. These systems analogous to that are getting this really critical data that goes directly to the meteorologist. The downside to this is these things aren't reusable or controllable. So, how would you attach a similar system to something like a drone that you could then launch on command, have it profile the atmosphere, essentially fly straight up and fly straight back down, and get that same data and be reusable? So that way, think about, some of these operations, we tend to think of it in terms of what the meteorologists need, which is, there's pressure, temperature, humidity, and wind speed data that goes back into the models. But even things like, sitting on the runway, getting de-iced, usually that comes from a probability of icing. It's not an accurate, assessment to say, yes, we have an icing event. It's really icing potential. And it's just better safe than sorry. So being able to have this data, for example, to say, oh, no, there's actually not an icing threat. So you don't have to de-ice in these conditions. So this really is going to change the way we think about weather forecasting to give us the capability of forecasting in real time, basically forecast on demand. So that way we can now cast this information. We know what's going to be happening in the very near future by getting this data that meteorologists can then act on.
Has a drone platform been developed that can fly the missions WindMap requires?
Yes, and so we're testing those systems now, working both with the National Weather Service and the FAA. We had a large campaign here in Tulsa this last year that we had about 50 different sites across the region that were flying systems up to 5,000 feet. And the real question is not whether the systems can do it, but whether we can do it safely. And it's about working with the FAA to be able to integrate these systems into the national airspace to make sure it does not impact the safety of current air traffic. And that's a real challenge right now. And that's the one that we're working through, and demonstrating literally this use case on a day-by-day basis.
Are these fixed wing, multi-rotor, or something hybrid?
These are mostly smaller rotary wing systems. It could be anything from a quadcopter, hexacopter, octocopter, or larger, or eVTOL systems that are going to be fixed wing that still have this small jump capability for a 0-point takeoff and landing. So the kind of range and scales from something that would fit in the palm of your hand, to much larger systems that may have several meter wingspans.
What's on the horizon in atmospheric science as it relates to drones?
Well, there are a couple of groups, right, that are doing C2 tornado measurements now, flying systems in and around tornadoes to be able to get measurements we haven't gotten before in terms of these really important thermodynamic and kinematic parameters about what's happening in the formation and development of tornadoes. But also, things such as, going back to this icing example, being able to take measurements along approach paths of aircraft, looking for things that are actually hazardous to the aircraft, such as icing, shear, vortex wakes, things that, again, are really difficult to measure, but provide a clear and present danger to aircraft.
For extreme weather, especially tornado research, how are you overcoming the challenge of deploying drones in high wind environments?
It becomes a really high-speed drone system. And you think about the technology that's been developed for the last decade that's gone into drone racing, really high-speed video for high-speed quadcopters. So you can adapt that technology for these systems that have relatively short flight times that can now fly from a tornado chaser's vehicle directly to a tornado, maybe a mile or two away. So, that technology exists now, and there have been several teams that have started to demonstrate this over the past couple of years.
In public safety, we've seen strong momentum with drones as first responder and search and rescue tools. From your perspective, what's accelerating adoption, and what's still holding it back?
Well, yeah, it really comes back down to this capability of being able to fly beyond visual line of sight. And so right now, the regulations in the U.S. are primarily requiring under Part 107 that the operator be able to see the drone. And so Part 108 regulations from the FAA are going to be put into place that allow, under pretty limited conditions, how you can fly beyond visual line of sight. And that's a real need for first responders. First off, from a operator scenario, they don't want to take a person out of a really critical role to go operate a drone. So they want to try to limit, the amount of manpower that takes to be able to do that. You want to be able to get the actual information. So if you can have someone else operating that's either not on the front line or able to provide that information from elsewhere, maybe getting that data before the first responders get on scene, that's really critical to be able to do that. And then, second is really pushing the limit of the technology. Can you fly for longer periods of time, farther away, being able to increase the range of not only the systems, how far they can fly, but also the range of the transmissions for your controllability and the video that you're able to get back. So we've been piloting a program here with the Tulsa Fire Department to demonstrate that, operating from downtown and flying beyond visual line of sight, using detection capabilities through network cameras to be able to make sure that the systems don't present any new hazard and are able to avoid both cooperative and non-cooperative aircraft. So we're really close, being able to have this technology in the hands of first responders across a really broad range of applications.
Drones are also making an impact in wildlife monitoring and conservation. What roles are you seeing in that space?
Yeah, again, we talked about first responders, and this is just going to be another tool in the tool chest of ecologists. Where they'll go out and be able to use this to get the data. At the end of the day, as a scientist, doesn't matter what kind of scientist you are, it's all about getting the data. It's getting the information. And this is going to be an asset then that allows them to increase their capability to get this data in new ways. Example of this is a project that we've been doing with a marine mammologist, Dr. Jason Bruck at Stephen F. Austin University in Texas, to essentially use a drone to actively acquire samples from dolphins in the wild. Dolphins surface, they breathe out. As part of that blow that they exhale when they surface, It includes really critical DNA information and other stressor samples that you can then use to determine what the health of that dolphin is. But that's a real challenge to be able to do that. We do this in whales now. Whales don't really care so much if there's a drone above them. Wild dolphins are really skittish, and you have to fly really close to the surface. How do you do that to be able to actually get a sample, from a dolphin? And so I think this is a good example of where this technology is going. There's a lot of work that still has to be done. We actually did our first flights this summer in the Gulf to be able to take those initial measurements to demonstrate that this actually works. But now it's putting this at a much larger scale. How do you get these systems out there and in the hands of ecologists, where again, they don't necessarily have to be trained aviators or pilots to be able to use this. They can now take this from a standpoint of, I'm really interested in getting the data to determine the health of the population. And I think as we'll see these systems roll out in the future, they're going to become more autonomous, more capable, going out and taking data for much longer periods of time. And it's just another example about how drones are changing the way that we do science.
Have you seen drones being integrated into city planning or urban development workflows?
It's funny. It's really kind of being driven primarily not from top down of the agency, but you have a technology enthusiast or a drone operator that's working within a city planning office and say, hey, we can start using this. How do you go out and use this technology? And once the planners start seeing the results of this and say, oh, look at this data that we get, right? That we can get this in real time and be able to use things such as orthomosaics or photogrammetry, to be able to reconstruct buildings in 3 dimensions, or get estimates of volumes, see the changing course of a river, or how parks are being utilized. Again, this is just going to be one of those things that we'll see in every city planner's toolkit in the very near future.
Is there anything that we missed that we should talk about?
This is a really exciting time for this technology development, and we going to change the way that kids get excited about this as a future career as well. You think about robots and aircraft, and you're really combining those together in drones, and it's just really exciting opportunities both for learning and thinking about new applications. I think we're really just at the edge of what we can do.
And for my final question, Dr. Jacob, what message would you like to leave regarding the future of the drone industry?
Well, I think the only analogy I like to use is, people didn't know what they would use smartphones for until smartphones were developed. And now we can't live without it. And I think we'll see the same thing with drones.
That's it for episode 448 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Dr. Jamey Jacob of the Oklahoma Aerospace Institute for Research and Education at Oklahoma State University. I want to thank Dr. Jacob for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about OSU's UAS Center or want to connect with Dr. Jacob, check out the webpage at go.okstate.edu/aerospace/. If you like the Drone Radio Show, then please subscribe and share, write a glowing review. And if you'd like to donate to keep the podcast going, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.